So what's next? Okay, at this point, aerobic metabolism of glucose. You have this down. You know that it goes through a process of involving glycolysis in the cytosol. You've got the citric acid cycle and oxidative phosphorylation. Through a lot of effort, you've come to a pretty good level of understanding of how this is a process going to be generating ATP, right? But glucose is not the only source of calories, the only source of energy that you're using as food, right? Generally, if we think about food, it's not just glucose. You're also using proteins, you're using other kinds of carbohydrates besides glucose. You're using fats as sources of calories. And I guess the question is, well, how do other sources, do we need to go through that whole process of metabolic detail for proteins and for fats? Well, the answer is no. Okay? Turns out everything ties in very nicely with what you've already learned in the context of the metabolism of glucose. Right? And then there's the other reason why we eat, right? We eat not only to provide the energy needs that help you get through your daily activities, we also have to make our own molecules. We have to repair tissues. We've got to continually replace our proteins. We have to replace our glycogen stores. We've got to make new molecules for growth. We've got to store fat molecules. There's a lot that goes on besides just metabolism of food molecules for calories. We also are using it for biosynthesis. And here you can use I call it the anabolism of your own biological molecules, right? And these two sections in your textbook are talking about these basic questions. And maybe you looked at them, maybe you're thinking, oh yeah, you feel pretty good about these diagrams. They make a lot of sense to you. Or maybe you're feeling like, this is pretty overwhelming, okay? And it really shouldn't be. And I want to talk you through basically what's going on here and what's going on with our next section, which we're looking at biosynthetic pathways and saying, well, these spaghetti diagrams are really kind of sensible if you're kind of putting things into the context of really two things. I think the two things that we really want to focus on is one, glucose. Another one is acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA is kind of like a central molecule for us, and you remember where acetyl-CoA fits into our discussions. In the past, we said that, well, glycolysis takes place in the cytosol. You get to the end of glycolysis, you have pyruvate, and then in the process of oxidizing the pyruvate, it gets converted into a carbon dioxide. This acetyl-CoA is a molecule that feeds into the citric acid cycle. And so this is a molecule that we talked about before, and it kind of represents a centerpiece. It's a center hub that relates to all forms of metabolism. So for example, right here, you can see that carbohydrates, anytime you eat a carbohydrate, it's going to go through glycolysis. It's going to become acetyl coenzyme A, which feeds into the citric acid cycle, right? Fats are going to be metabolized into fatty acids. Fatty acids undergo this thing called beta oxidation to create acetyl coenzyme A, which feeds the citric acid cycle. Proteins, broken down to amino acids, part of their breakdown products, at least some of the amino acids, is acetyl coenzyme A. In other words, whether you're eating proteins or carbohydrates or fats, one thing that's very likely to be produced as a metabolic intermediate is acetyl-CoA. Right? And so let me go back to the whiteboard share, and I wanted to just diagram this to give you a simplified version of those two spaghetti diagrams in a single chart. Right? And so right now, think about food. Right? Your book talked about peanuts and how peanuts contain protein. They contain carbohydrate. They contain fats, lipids, triglycerides, right? And so these are like three the 4 kinds of biological molecules we studied in an earlier unit, earlier module, right? Well, we're not thinking about nucleic acids here. Let's just focus on these 3. And you know, for example, that catabolism of proteins gives rise to amino acids, right? You know that carbohydrates, whether we're looking at a polysaccharide or a monosaccharide, maybe a monosaccharide can be converted into glucose, maybe a carbohydrate, a polysaccharide would have to get converted into a monosaccharide, which ultimately get converted into glucose. Okay? And once you get to glucose, you know what's going to happen at that point. Glucose will undergo glycolysis, et cetera, et cetera. Fats, they break down to glycerol, but let's focus on the fatty acid parts. Right? Because most of what's there in a triglyceride are going to be those 3 fatty acids. And a fatty acid then undergoes this process of beta oxidation to create that other molecule that we cared about, the acetyl coenzyme A. It's actually the acetyl group on the coenzyme A. The CoA is a coenzyme, it's a cofactor. Okay, whereas AC CoA. It's the way that it's abbreviated in the textbook. And you know that once you get to acetyl coenzyme A, this is the thing that's going to be feeding into the citric acid cycle. We're going to be having oxidative phosphorylation, OXPHOS, which is going to be generating a whole bunch of ATP. And so basically, once you get to acetyl coenzyme A, you can see, oh, it's going to go through all of this pathway, giving rise to a whole lot of ATP, right? So ATP production is understood from this point. You can say glucose is going to be feeding into acetyl coenzyme A. Amino acids also get broken down into acetyl coenzyme A, and then they're basically going to be metabolized. So in other words, if you were to be eating a strictly protein diet, you went on a strictly protein diet, not eating any carbohydrates or fats, the amino acids that you take in with your diet would be used for ATP production, but the amino acids would basically be metabolized. They would be modified into the acetyl groups on acetyl coenzyme A. And then from that point, you know what's going to happen with the citric acid cycle, OXPHOS generating ATP. Right? And so this is, this is, I think, a pretty straightforward thing. Really doesn't matter what kind of food you eat. It's all going to go into a process that is going to be kind of familiar, especially once we get down to citric acid and OXPHOS phases. Okay. Now, the other side of this question, the other question that we have here is, what about biosynthesis? Biosynthesis of your proteins. This requires amino acids. Obviously, you need to have amino acids to make your own proteins, to make your fats. Okay, you need to have glycerol. You also need to have fatty acids. Okay. And then to make your own like glycogen. You need to have glucose. Glucose is a pretty central monosaccharide. And so we know that when we have to make our own proteins, we have to make our own fats, we have to make our own glycogens. And in order to do that, we need to have a source of amino acids, we need to have a source of fatty acids. But we also have to have a need for glucose, right? And so you're thinking, well, that's pretty easy, right? I'm eating protein. The protein gets metabolized into amino acids. And so while some of those amino acids might be metabolized to create ATP, because that might be my only source of calories, some of those amino acids can go directly into protein synthesis. I can take an amino acid that I'm breaking off one of my food molecules and turn it into one of my own proteins. That's totally understandable. That Makes perfect sense, right? You're getting raw materials for your own protein synthesis by eating amino acids. If you were doing a bodybuilding thing, right? If you were trying to generate a lot of muscle, right? You'd be working out, but you would also be taking some type of protein supplement. And the reason for that is that if you're going to be building your own proteins, you need to be feeding your protein synthesis with an abundant source of amino acids, right? But here's the thing: not all amino acids have to come from the amino acids you eat, because if you were to go on a protein-free diet, okay, so if you had a very low protein diet, you might not have enough amino acids to make your own proteins, which means that you would have to make your amino acids through some other mechanism. Okay? And what I'm saying here is that you can start off with acetylcoenzyme A. This would be the starting point. Okay? And you could make amino acids using acetylcoenzyme A as a starting material. You also have intermediates from the citric acid cycle that could also be used as a starting point for the synthesis of granule amino acids. Okay? And so, energy metabolism is also tied to biosynthesis, because these building blocks, these building block molecules of amino acids, are really the same whether we're talking about the proteins, the amino acids that we're made out of, and the amino acids and the proteins that are coming from our food. Good. Okay. Now let's think about fats, right? Okay, so you need to make more fats. Let me change color here. So let's go with light green, right? You need to make your own fats, and in order to do that, you're going to have to generate your own fatty acids. And once you get the fatty acids, and provided we have a glycerol, you can take those 3 of those fatty acids, attach them to the glycerol, then you've got your own triglyceride. No problem. That's straight up things we've talked about so far, right? You also know, that theoretically we could take fatty acids from our food, and that could be one source of the fatty acids. But the majority of the fatty acids that we make are coming from the synthesis by basically reversing this reaction, right? This reaction where fatty acids get broken down into acetylcoenzyme A, you could reverse that beta oxidation, start off with acetylcoenzyme A, and make fatty acids for the synthesis of new fats, right? Which kind of makes sense in a weird way. I think some people ask the question, well, how could I possibly become fattier? How could I convert potatoes, which are starches, and you know that you break down potato starch into lots of glucoses. If I'm making lots of glucoses from the breakdown of potatoes, how could I ever become fat from that? Well, the answer is pretty easy. You make the glucose, then you metabolize it partway to make acetylcoenzyme A. If you have a huge supply of acetylcoenzyme A, all the extra acetylcoenzyme A goes into the conversion. It gets converted into fatty acids, which then gets stored as your adipose tissue, your fatty tissue, right? And so, yeah, all the extra energy, if we have any excess acetylcoenzyme A because we're eating either too much fats, either too much carbohydrates, too much proteins, we'll end up with a big storehouse of acetylcoenzyme A, and all the extra gets converted back into fatty acids, which then gets stored in the body as body fat. Is that pretty awesome? I think so. Okay. Here's another cool little factoid for you. It has to deal with the fact that, well, sometimes, obviously, breaking down a carbohydrate like a polysaccharide like starch that releases lots of glucose, and we can sort of see how that's going to generate ATP. We don't necessarily need to eat carbohydrates, right? In fact, there are popular diets in use right now where you restrict severely your carbohydrate intake. And some people do this voluntarily. Some people do this because they don't really have any carbohydrates available, like the Inuit Okay, the Inuit living in igloos through long periods of the winter, they don't have access to any plant material. They basically eat only meat and fish for 4 to 6 months of the year, and so they're not taking in any glucose. And so you could say, well, that's not a problem because protein and fats are giving them all the energy that they need, right? But the thing is, the brain requires glucose as an energy source. The brain wants to do this. And so if we don't have glucose to feed our brains, we actually have to synthesize glucose from something else. And you can't make glucose from acetyl coenzyme A, right? You can, however, make glucose from amino acids. Okay? And this is one of the reasons why people can be on the North Beach diet or the Atkins diet and not starve the brain. So if you're eating enough protein, you could satisfy the glucose needs for your brain, right? And so yeah, obviously, making glycogen could come either from the glucose that we take in from our carbohydrate intake, or we could actually make glucose from scratch, or maybe not from scratch. It has got a name. It's called gluconeogenesis. We're making brand new glucose from other things that we have around in our bodies, right? And so yeah, there's a lot that goes on here. I just, for me, it makes sense to consider what's going on the biosynthetic side of things, and then what's going on the side of the food side of things, and how it ties to energy metabolism. And they're all related, okay? And when you think about those, when you think about this in these contexts, it'll make more sense what's going on with diagrams like this, right? All the things we talked about here is what we talked about with glycolysis, acetyl coenzyme citric acid cycle, oxphos producing ATP. And this is exactly what he just said. Fats get converted into fatty acids, get converted into acetyl-CoA. Proteins get converted into amino acids, which become CoA. We're also saying that these amino acids can become pyruvate, or they could become intermediates in the citric acid cycle. I didn't include those in my diagram, okay, because I wanted to make things streamlined. And then when you look at the spaghetti diagram in the next section of the textbook, we're really talking about the synthesis of our proteins, the synthesis of our amino acids, the synthesis of our carbohydrates. And so the sugars that we get can be converted into our glycogen stores. The fats that we store are coming from fatty acids, which can be coming from acetyl-CoA. Okay? And the proteins can be synthesized either from the amino acids that we're eating or from some indirect means, including acetyl-CoA, including pyruvate, including intermediates of the citric acid cycle. In other words, what happened with the diagram that I gave you is really just another version of what's there in the textbook, and the instruction that I'm providing to you verbally is intended to support and maybe make the things that you're reading about in the textbook more clear. All right, and that's it for metabolic biochemistry. We launch into a brand new field in the next lecture. See you then.